I walked into my own retirement banquet, expecting to be honored. Instead, my daughter looked me in the eye and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Tacky, old man, you're just bitter because I have money." Her words cut deeper than any knife. The room went silent, and not one guest stood up for me. My own son-in-law smirked, nodding in agreement. For a moment, I felt crushed. After all those years of working 2 jobs, paying her tuition, carrying her future on my back. But what she didn't know was that I had already been collecting documents, witnesses, and proof of every scheme she and her in-laws had set in motion, and when the day came, I carried it all into court. Do you want to know how my family's trap unraveled, and how I turned their own lies against them? Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. The evening air in Houston carried a faint scent of spring, soft and warm against the skin as I stepped out of my car in front of the country club. The lot was filled with vehicles that gleamed under the lights. Imports, luxury sedans, even a limousine tucked to one side. My old Buick looked like a relic in their midst. For a moment, standing there with my cane in hand, the contrast made me smile to myself. This night was meant to mark my years of labor, my retirement, my supposed legacy. Inside, the banquet hall shimmered with light and expense. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, catching every sparkle from the sequined gowns and tailored suits of the guests. Tables were set with silverware so polished I could see my reflection in them, and plates carried appetizers that looked more like ornaments than food. I had lived modestly, never cared for such extravagance. But here it was, Shayna's stage. My daughter had spared no cost. At least that's how it looked on the surface. Guests moved about in clusters, voices rising in laughter that seemed to carry a rehearsed tone. Every so often, I caught a pair of eyes sliding toward me, then darting away quickly, as if they had been caught doing something shameful. The weight of those glances pressed down on me more than I cared to admit. Their smiles never quite reached their eyes when they greeted me, and their handshakes felt like obligations rather than warmth. I found my seat at the head of a long table draped in white linen, roses blooming in tall glass vases at its center. The name card read, "Honored Guest," written in calligraphy so ornate I could hardly recognize my own title. I rested my cane against the chair and lowered myself slowly, watching as people drifted into place around me. A murmur ran through the crowd when Shayna entered, Darren at her side, both of them glowing with confidence. She wore a crimson dress that demanded attention, her smile wide and commanding. For a brief moment, pride swelled in my chest. She was my daughter, my little girl who used to run barefoot across the front lawn with pigtails flying behind her. Now she carried herself like she owned the room, but as I studied her, the pride twisted into something else. The look in her eyes when they brushed over me was not affection, it was calculation. Dinner began, plates clinking as servers moved with quiet precision. The speeches followed, short anecdotes from colleagues, polite acknowledgments from acquaintances. Each word seemed to float in the air without substance. It felt less like a celebration of my life's work and more like a performance staged for someone else's gain. Then came the moment that cut the evening in half. As one of Shayna's friends finished a toast, I noticed Shayna herself standing near the podium. She leaned forward, wineglass in hand, her expression shifting, her lips curled, and with a voice sharp enough to slice the chatter, she spat out the words, "Tacky, old man. You're just bitter because I have money." The hall fell silent. Forks clattered onto plates. Heads turned. My ears rang with the echo of her voice bouncing off the walls. For a second, I thought I had misheard, that maybe the years had dulled more than just my joints. But the wide eyes of the guests confirmed it. The insult was real. A sting burned deep in my chest, spreading like fire. There I sat, the supposed guest of honor, reduced to a punchline in my own daughter's spectacle. I felt my hand tighten around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, words gathered on my tongue, sharp and hot. But I swallowed them down. This was not the place, not the time. Let her think she had won this round. Darren's chuckle followed like a cruel aftershock. He leaned in beside Shayna, shaking his head as if amused. "She's right," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Some people just don't know how to keep up." Laughter rippled among a few guests. Others looked down at their plates, unwilling to meet my eyes. Their silence was no comfort. In fact, it cut deeper than Darren's mockery. Friends who had once shaken my hand with respect now chose to fade into the wallpaper, unwilling to risk their own comfort by standing with me. A coldness spread inside, heavier than the insult itself. Betrayal doesn't always roar. It whispers through the absence of voices when you need them most. I scanned the faces around me, searching for even a flicker of defense, but found none. I forced my breathing steady, resting my hand on the cane beside me. Inside, the bitterness curled, but outwardly I shaped my lips into a thin smile. If no one would defend me, I would defend myself by not breaking in front of them. The speeches resumed half-heartedly, though every word felt hollow after what had happened. My mind no longer registered the praise or the jokes. All I could hear was Shayna's voice replaying, cruel and confident. At last, as another speaker rose, I gripped the cane tightly and pushed myself to my feet. My body trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding every emotion in check. I nodded politely, muttered something about needing fresh air, and turned toward the door. As I passed the head table, Shayna leaned toward Darren. Their whispers carried just enough for me to catch. "This is just the beginning." The words lodged like a thorn. My steps quickened, carrying me out into the Houston night. The cool air wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth inside. Stars blinked overhead, distant and silent. The sound of her insult, her threat, still rang in my ears. And with it came the chilling certainty that what I had endured tonight was only the surface. Something deeper, darker, was waiting beneath. The next morning, the house was so still that even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee, I kept hearing Shayna's voice from the night before. The words she had chosen, sharp, public, final, were not the sort that could be brushed aside as a moment of frustration. They carried weight, like stones dropped into the quiet pond of my life, rippling through every memory I had of her as a little girl. The table where I sat was scarred from years of use, but I had kept it sturdy, just like the roof over her head when she was growing up. She never knew about the nights I worked late shifts, or the bills I juggled so she could go to camp, or how I put off fixing my own teeth so she could have braces. And yet, in one breath, she had called me useless. A relic. The sting of that truth, at least the truth as she framed it, would not leave me. A faint bitterness crept in as I stared at the wall clock, its second hand jerking forward. She had grown into a woman who measured worth in cars, in handbags, in social standing, but those things had nothing to do with the hours I spent sitting by her bed when she was sick, or the way I cheered at her high school graduation. My life had been invested in hers, and last night she treated me like an unpaid debt she'd been forced to carry. Her husband, Darren, didn't help matters. I could still see his smirk, a thin smile that showed no warmth. He had leaned back in his chair, laughing softly, as if her insult had been a well-crafted joke. That laugh turned the knife in me. It made her words sound like a performance rehearsed between the two of them, not a slip of the tongue in a heated moment. They had chosen that stage, that crowd, to unveil their judgment of me. The humiliation sank deeper with that realization. They hadn't simply reacted, they had plotted. I had walked into that banquet hall expecting to celebrate the closing of one chapter in my life. Instead, it felt like they had written me out of their story entirely. As I sat there, the silence of the kitchen became its own kind of punishment. No voices, no footsteps, no laughter, just quiet. But it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The kind of quiet that makes a man's chest tighten, that reminds him of how quickly a room full of people can turn away. I replayed the faces from last night, people I had known for decades, colleagues, neighbors, friends. When Shayna's words echoed through the hall, not a single person stepped forward. Some looked down at their shoes. Some pretended to sip their wine. A few even smirked as though they had been waiting for it. That silence wounded more than her insult. Words can be fought, challenged, corrected, but silence, Silence was complicity. I pushed my chair back and walked to the window. The morning light fell across my old Ford truck parked in the driveway, rust around the wheel wells, a dent on the passenger door. But that truck had carried Shayna to soccer practice, to band rehearsals, to college tours. She used to climb in the back seat with her hair wet from the pool, laughing about some joke with her friends. I had kept that truck alive, mile after mile, to give her a life that felt normal, even when my pockets were empty. And yet, the daughter who once rested her head against the window on long drives now saw me as disposable. That thought should have broken me, but instead, it hardened something inside. I realized then that I could not let the silence of others, or the scorn of my own child, define who I was. The phone buzzed on the table, startling me out of my thoughts. A text from Shayna lit up the screen. "We'll talk soon. It's time you sign those papers." My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. The words blurred for a moment, but the meaning was clear. The banquet had been the opening act. This demand, was the real show. The phone buzzed again in my hand, each vibration pressing heavier on my chest. The drawer creaked as it slid open, the old wood groaning under the weight of years. Inside lay pieces of a life I once thought would mean something, envelopes stuffed with bills, school portraits in cracked plastic sleeves, and report cards with smudged ink from decades ago. Each slip of paper carried its own story. There were the electric bills that went unpaid so Shayna could have her debate uniforms, receipts for car repairs when I kept the truck running instead of replacing it, just so there'd be money for her textbooks. Even the faded permission slips I signed with tired hands after long shifts at the refinery. The smell of old paper mixed with a faint trace of engine oil still clinging from my hands, stirring a memory of standing outside Shayna's high school on a chilly morning. She had a speech to give, and I'd waited proudly in the car until she came out, her face glowing with confidence. I had been there for her in every way that mattered, yet her words at the banquet, "Tacky old man, you're just bitter because I have money," still echoed, sharp as broken glass. The bitterness of her accusation clashed with the fragile memories scattered before me, sacrifices that had cost me nights of sleep, years of health, moments with my late wife I'd never get back. All of it had been poured into giving her the start she needed. The drawer had become a graveyard of proof, and standing over it, I couldn't help but feel mocked by the life she now paraded as if I had played no part. Coffee hissed as it poured into the cup, steam fogging my glasses. Outside the window, my old Ford truck sat under the afternoon sun, its paint dulled by time, tires worn but still rolling. That truck had carried her to every high school debate, every part-time job, every friend's house she begged to visit. I could almost hear her laughter from the passenger seat, the way she'd roll her eyes at my off-key singing. Those moments, those sacrifices, had built her path. And now she looked down on me as though I were an obstacle rather than the foundation. The insult of being called bitter stung deeper than I expected. It wasn't just a word. It was a denial, an erasure of everything I had done to make her life possible. She flaunted her wealth as though it had sprung from nowhere, as if the countless double shifts I worked, the dinners I skipped, the debts I carried were meaningless. The injustice burned hotter the longer I sat with it. The voices from the banquet wouldn't leave me. Darren's smug chuckle. The silence of the guests. The way no one dared speak up on my behalf. That kind of silence is more cutting than any insult. It makes you invisible. It makes you disposable. As anger pushed against the sorrow, something shifted inside. Humiliation had marked too many years already. I couldn't let it continue. The truth of my life, the sacrifices that made her success possible, couldn't be rewritten by the smirks of an ungrateful daughter or the nods of complicit strangers. The phone on the counter lit up, vibrating once, twice. A voicemail notification glowed on the screen. With a thumb heavy from hesitation, I pressed play. Richard Boone's voice came through, smooth and cold, the kind of tone that carried no warmth, only calculation. "We'll make sure Shayna gets what she deserves. Don't stand in the way." The message ended abruptly, leaving silence louder than any words. My hand trembled as I set the phone down, the sound of it tapping the counter sharp in the quiet kitchen. This wasn't just about a daughter's careless cruelty anymore. A larger scheme had begun to unfold, and I was standing in its path. The morning air carried a strange heaviness as I pulled my old Ford into the small parking lot of Patricia Lowell's office. The building wasn't much, just a two-story brick space wedged between a coffee shop and an accountant's office. Still, I trusted Patricia. She had handled my late wife's estate with care and dignity. If anyone could help me make sense of the threat I'd received, it was her. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Patricia greeted me with that steady calm she always carried, her glasses perched low on her nose. When she led me back into her office, I felt the weight of what I had to say pressing on my chest. I told her everything: the banquet, Shayna's cruel words, Darren's smirk, and finally, Richard Boone's voicemail. Patricia's brow furrowed as I spoke, her pen resting on the yellow pad before her. She didn't interrupt, but I could see she was fitting the pieces together in her mind. "There's more here than just humiliation," she said finally, her tone measured. "The Boones aren't the type to bluff. If they've already spoken about papers, then something legal is in motion." Unease crept down my spine. I had suspected as much, but hearing it from Patricia made the fear concrete. She turned to her file cabinet, pulled out a thin folder, and slid it across the desk. Inside were preliminary drafts she had managed to obtain through courthouse channels. My heart clenched as my eyes landed on the bold words at the top. Guardianship petition. The language was chilling. Phrases like incapacity and unfit to manage personal affairs. My name filled the blanks. Shayna's signature and the Boone name appeared as interested parties. The paper trembled in my hand. "They're trying to take my life away," I whispered. Patricia nodded gravely. "If this moves forward uncontested, they can strip you of authority over your finances, your property, everything. Shayna could make decisions on your behalf, regardless of your wishes." Betrayal burned hotter than the Houston sun outside, so this was what she meant by "sign those papers." Not a contract, not some family agreement, a plan to erase me, to paint me as too old, too weak, too senile to fight back. Darren's chuckle at the banquet, Shayna's smirk, they weren't random acts of cruelty. They were rehearsals, setting the stage to make me look diminished. Patricia reached across the desk, her voice firm. "You need to gather proof. Gerald, bank statements, property deeds, any correspondence that shows your competence and history of responsible management. And people who will testify to your clarity of mind. Do not wait." Her words lit a spark. I thought of Harvey Denton, an old friend who had known me since our factory days, Lydia Kranz, my neighbor, who still saw me fixing my truck every Saturday morning. They could stand beside me, tell the truth of who I was. When I left Patricia's office, the daylight seemed sharper, almost cutting. I sat in my truck, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching families walk past on the sidewalk, parents holding children's hands, laughter spilling out as they crossed the street toward the coffee shop. It was the kind of simple scene that used to warm me. Now it only reminded me of how quickly family could turn into adversary when money clouded their hearts. I pulled a notepad from the glove compartment and began to write names. Harvey, Lydia, old co-workers, even the pastor from my late wife's church. I would not let Shayna and the Boones rewrite my life. The phone buzzed on the seat beside me. For a moment, I hoped it might be someone reaching out with kindness. Instead, the screen lit up with Shayna's name. "Dad, dinner tomorrow night. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." My chest tightened. There was no warmth in those words, only threat. It wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. As I started the engine, the glow of her message burned in my mind. The battle had only just begun. The drive to Shayna's house felt longer than it should have, though it was only 20 minutes from my modest home in Houston to their polished suburban development. The air was heavy with late spring humidity, the kind that pressed against the chest and reminded me of summers spent working overtime shifts. The sight of her driveway crowded with expensive cars only made the pit in my stomach deepen. Mine was the only truck parked out front, its faded paint and rusted edges a stark contrast to the gleaming sedans. The door opened before I knocked twice. Shayna smiled thinly, her lips curved without warmth. Darren appeared behind her, already carrying a glass of wine like he needed it to steady himself. Inside, the smell of roasted lamb filled the house. The dining room gleamed with candles and polished silverware. Richard and Margaret Boone sat at the table, sipping from crystal glasses, as though I had wandered into a boardroom instead of a family dinner. Polite words floated across the table. "You're looking well. Hope you enjoyed your retirement banquet," but none carried sincerity. Their eyes measured me, not greeted me. I lowered myself into the chair offered, listening as Richard steered the conversation toward future plans and retirement security. My fork hung in the air, food untouched, because I could hear the undertones. This wasn't a dinner, it was a negotiation. The unease tightened into something sharper when Darren leaned forward, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Gerald, I think we all worry about you managing things alone. Money can get tricky at your age." The words hit like a slap, but I forced my jaw to stay still. Shayna took that moment to place a folder neatly in the center of the table. Her manicured fingers tapped the edge as though she'd been waiting for the cue. "It's nothing complicated, Dad," she said. "Just some papers that make things easier for everyone. Darren and I can handle the bills, the property taxes, the investments. You won't have to worry anymore." My pulse quickened. Patricia's warning echoed from yesterday. "If they bring papers, do not sign anything without me there." I stared at the folder as if it were a snake coiled and ready to strike. Margaret leaned closer, her voice coated in syrup. "You've done enough. Gerald, let the younger generation carry the load. You've earned your rest." Rest. That was their word for erasure. The pressure mounted. Darren pushed the folder toward me, his smile widening like a salesman closing in on a deal. "All you need is one signature." My hand trembled as I reached for my water glass, not the pen. The memory of the banquet flared. Shayna's words, the laughter, the silence of the crowd. I wouldn't give them another victory. "I'll review these with my lawyer," I said evenly, sliding the folder back across the polished wood. The air grew thick. Shayna's smile faltered, then hardened. Margaret's face flushed with irritation. "Ungrateful!" she hissed, barely disguising the venom. Richard leaned back, his voice calm but edged. "If you refuse, Gerald, we can always take this to court. Judges don't look kindly on stubborn old men." The insult curled in my chest, but anger steadied my hand this time. I straightened, cane pressed against my leg, and looked each of them in the eye. "If you want my signature, you'll have to earn it in court," I said. Each word measured, deliberate. Silence followed. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery abandoned on plates. The line had been drawn, and we all knew it. Shayna slammed the folder shut, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Then you leave us no choice." I rose slowly from the table, heart pounding but voice steady. "Then that's where we'll meet." The walk to the front door felt lighter than my entrance, though the air outside was thick and heavy. The night sky stretched above, the cicadas buzzing in the trees. I could still feel their eyes on my back, the war they had just declared. Stepping into the cool night, I realized the gloves had finally come off. Patricia's office was quiet when I stepped inside that morning, but my chest was anything but calm. The mahogany shelves behind her desk seemed to lean in as she studied me. After last night's dinner, my pulse hadn't settled once. She closed the file in front of her and said in a steady voice, "Gerald, what they tried to make you sign, it wasn't just intimidation, it's more serious." Her tone carried the weight of confirmation I didn't want. She explained that what Shayna and Darren had pushed across the table was the first step toward guardianship or a power of attorney grab. They want control over everything, your accounts, your house, your medical decisions, Patricia said. Her eyes didn't waver. I felt the walls press closer. "And if I'd signed, they'd already have the keys to your life," she answered. Then she slid another paper toward me. "I checked the courthouse this morning. There are preliminary filings in motion. They're already moving without you." A chill gripped my spine. It wasn't just dinner games. It was an attack, legal and calculated. Driving home afterward, the Houston sun felt harsher than usual, glaring off the windshield. When I reached my mailbox, a thick envelope was waiting. My name sat bold across the front. Inside was a notice stamped with the county seal. Capacity evaluation request. The words hit like a slap. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had filed to question my ability to manage my affairs. The paper suggested I wasn't fit to make decisions, that someone else needed to step in for my protection. Shayna's smirk from last night flashed in my mind. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a misunderstanding. She wanted me painted senile, incompetent, so she could claim what wasn't hers yet. Rage and fear wrestled in my chest, neither willing to back down. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the notice spread out in front of me. The lamp's glow turned the words into a cruel spotlight. After decades of balancing bills, saving every cent for Shayna's education, managing a mortgage with the precision of a soldier, they wanted to brand me incapable. I thought about the late shifts I'd worked, the birthdays I'd missed to earn tuition money, the meals I skipped so she never would. Now the payoff for all those sacrifices was humiliation dressed up in legal jargon. I picked up the phone and dialed Harvey Denton. His voice, steady and familiar, came through the line. "Gerald, what's going on?" I told him enough. He didn't interrupt, just listened. Finally, he said, "I'll write whatever statement you need. Anyone who's spoken to you for 5 minutes knows you're sharp as ever." Relief pressed down on me, not enough to crush the anger, but enough to steady my resolve. That night, a new message pinged onto my phone. Shayna's number lit up the screen. "Dad, we'll make this easier for you if you just cooperate. Otherwise, everyone will know. Everyone will know." The words carried a threat, exposure, shame, or worse. They thought silence would corner me, that intimidation would make me fold. I opened my old leather-bound journal and pressed the pen down hard on the paper. My handwriting shook with fury. But the words were steady. They think silence means weakness. They've forgotten silence is how I plan my strike. I had just set the pen down when the phone rang again. Not Shayna this time, Lydia Kranz, the neighbor whose sharp eyes missed little. "Gerald," she whispered, as if afraid someone was listening, "I saw Richard Boone in your driveway earlier today. He went toward your back door. I think he was inside." My grip tightened on the cane at my side. So it wasn't just papers and threats anymore. They had crossed into my home, into my sanctuary. I stared at the notice on the table, at Shayna's message glowing coldly on my phone, and now Lydia's warning rang in my ears. The war hadn't just started. It was on my doorstep. The shadows were no longer across town or in a lawyer's file. They were inside my walls. The study smelled faintly of dust and old paper, a scent that usually carried comfort. That night, after Lydia's warning, it carried only unease. The filing cabinet in the corner sat slightly ajar, as if someone hadn't bothered to close it all the way. That was my cabinet, locked, secure, holding decades of my life. Kneeling down, the metal drawer scraped as I pulled it open, and a shiver ran through me. Envelopes had shifted, folders slightly bent, as if careless hands had rifled through them. A surge of suspicion tightened my chest. These weren't just papers, they were the map of sacrifices I had made. Mortgages paid, deeds secured, insurance forms tucked away. Someone had tried to thread through my past, and it wasn't curiosity, it was strategy. The thought that my daughter's new family had stepped over my threshold to rifle through my history made the air heavier, colder. Shuffling deeper into the drawer, I found something that stopped me cold. A folded sheet, deliberately tucked behind my legitimate documents. My eyes narrowed as I slid it out. At first glance, it mimicked one of my property deeds, but the typeface was off, the ink too fresh, and scrawled at the bottom was a signature, mine, or what someone wanted the world to believe was mine. I traced the pen strokes, the uneven pressure. Whoever forged it had a steady hand, but not mine. The loops on the G in Gerald were stiff, forced, and in the margin, almost careless, was handwriting I recognized all too well. Darren's blocky letters, the same as on birthday cards he once signed for Shayna. Rage coiled in my gut. They hadn't just insulted me at dinner, they were planting evidence to erase me altogether. The phone was in my hand before I realized it. I dialed Shayna, my breath unsteady. When her voice came through, calm and syrupy, the words burned on my tongue. "You broke into my home," I said, each word deliberate. Silence stretched, and then her reply came sharp, cold. "We're only protecting what's ours." Dad. Ours. As if everything I built belonged to them by default. As if my life, my work, my name were all just placeholders until they claimed them. The audacity hollowed me out, but it also lit something hotter. They were drawing their lines openly now. If that's how they wanted to play it, I'd answer in kind. By the end of that week, I sat across from Harvey Denton at the diner, coffee steaming between us. He leaned in, lowering his voice, his eyes steady. "You're as sharp as ever, Gerald." I'll swear to that. Relief stirred faintly, though it was tempered by his next words. He mentioned spotting Richard Boone lingering near my fence days ago, carrying something under his arm. The confirmation twisted my unease into certainty. Lydia had been right. They were circling me like vultures. That evening, when the house settled into its usual creaks, a faint scrape sounded at the front door. By the time I opened it, whoever had been there was gone, leaving only an envelope slid under the frame. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but fury as I tore it open. Inside was a printed copy of a so-called resignation of property rights. At the bottom, a signature meant to be mine sprawled across the page. My name, falsified, weaponized. The lamp on my desk cast its yellow glow over the page as I held it close. The thought pressed heavier than the paper itself. They wanted me erased on paper before I could even set foot in court. The fury was steady now, not wild, a flame-controlled, ready to burn only where aimed. They thought an old man could be cornered quietly. They were wrong. The drive to Shayna's house felt longer than it was. Headlights from other cars sweeping across my windshield as if they were eyes judging me. The invitation hadn't been one I could refuse. She'd called it a family meeting. Those words had once meant pot roast dinners and laughter at the kitchen table. Tonight, they felt like a summons to trial. The front door opened before I could knock. Darren stood there, crisp shirt, cologne strong enough to burn. His smile never reached his eyes. "Dad," he said, as if the words still belonged to me. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and expensive wine. The dining room table gleamed like an altar, everyone already in their seats. Shayna, Richard, Margaret, and even Mara, who looked like she'd been dragged along reluctantly. I lowered myself into a chair opposite them. The silence had weight. My cane leaned against the table leg, the only thing I trusted to keep me upright in that room. Richard Boone adjusted his cufflinks and slid a manila folder forward, his voice calm and rehearsed. "Gerald, let's not waste time. You've already agreed to this transfer. We're just here to finalize." My stomach tightened. He spread out the papers as if they were gospel. At the top, in bold, my name. Below it, a scrawl meant to be my signature. My eyes narrowed. This was the same forgery I'd found tucked behind my files. Shayna leaned in, voice soft enough to sound caring to anyone who didn't know better. "Dad, you signed this weeks ago. Maybe you just don't remember. It happens." Her hand brushed Mara's shoulder as if to steady her, but her eyes locked on me like a dare. The words clawed at me. They weren't just trying to steal property. They were trying to rewrite my mind. Gaslight me into believing I'd lost it. For a moment, my heart stumbled in my chest. Had anyone else at the table already decided I was senile? Richard's smirk answered the question before I asked it. "No shame in stepping aside gracefully. Gerald, we'll make sure you're comfortable." I straightened in my chair, my hands steady despite the fury boiling inside. "Funny," I said evenly, "how this supposed agreement has dates that don't match, and a notary stamp that expired 2 years ago." I pushed the papers back toward him, my cane tapping the floor like a gavel. "If you're going to forge my name, at least get the details right." Margaret's face flushed red. "You're humiliating yourself, clinging to scraps of authority. This family needs stability, not an old man's pride." Before I could answer, the door to the hallway opened. Harvey Denton stepped in, his presence solid, dependable. He nodded to me, then turned his gaze to the table. "I was asked to be here tonight," he said, his voice carrying a weight none of them expected. "Gerald is of sound mind, and I saw Richard near his property last week, snooping." The room fractured instantly. Richard sputtered. Margaret slammed her hand on the table, and Shayna's mask cracked. "You don't understand," she hissed. Everything we've done is to protect what's ours. But it was Mara who cut through the noise. Her voice trembled, but the words hit like thunder. Protect? I heard you two. She pointed at Shayna and Darren, planning to bleed Dad dry before the courts even got involved. I heard every word. Silence swallowed the room. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Shayna's hand froze in mid-gesture. Darren's jaw clenched so tight I thought it might snap. Margaret looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time, and Richard's face went pale beneath his tan. I stood, cane in hand, and let the silence settle heavy before I spoke. The truth is out. This fight won't be decided at this table. It will be decided in court. I turned, leaving the table behind me. The night air outside felt sharp, almost cleansing. Behind me, the house was silent, not from peace, but from fracture. As I walked away, I knew this wasn't family anymore. This was war. Sunday sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting streaks of color across the church pews. Sitting in my usual spot near the aisle, I felt the shift in the air before the sermon even began. Heads turned, whispers flowed like a tide, and every so often, a glance darted my way before sliding off as though I were a ghost. The words my daughter had thrown at me, and the chaos that erupted at her dining table, had leaked into the community. People I had known for decades, a choir partner, an old fishing buddy, neighbors who had once shared meals at my kitchen table, sat stiff and careful, as if my presence now carried scandal. I straightened my shoulders and fixed my gaze on the pulpit, pretending not to notice, though each murmur struck sharper than Shayna's insults. After service, as I moved toward the door, a man I recognized only vaguely brushed past and whispered, "They're saying you've lost your mind. Be careful who you trust." His words chilled me more than the draft slipping through the open doors. I understood then, this wasn't just a family war anymore. It was a public spectacle. By Tuesday, the gossip had thickened into a fog. Walking down my block, I saw curtains twitch and conversations halt mid-sentence. The familiar wave from the Johnsons never came. Even the mailman kept his eyes down. Only Lydia Krantz crossed the invisible line, her voice low and urgent as she leaned across my fence. "Gerald," she said, "I heard Margaret Boone at the grocery store. She was bragging, said you'd be declared incompetent within weeks." She sounded certain. Heat rose in my chest. Not just anger, but humiliation. These were my streets, my neighbors, people who'd seen me shovel driveways and coach Little League years ago. Now they were letting lies replace memory. I clenched my jaw, realizing that Richard and Margaret were building a campaign of character assassination, brick by brick, rumor by rumor. That afternoon I sat across from Patricia Lowell in her office, the blinds half drawn against the Texas sun. She laid a stack of documents between us, her finger tapping on the top page. "They've filed reports," she said. Her tone clipped. "False ones, claiming you've been confused, forgetful, that you've mishandled your accounts. They've even attached community statements, probably coerced." I felt my stomach twist, but Patricia leaned forward, her eyes steady. "We're not defenseless. Harvey's testimony holds weight, and Mara's slip at the dinner table, if she's willing to confirm it, could expose their intent. And this..." She slid another paper toward me. "Richard bribed a notary. We can prove it. The stamp is fraudulent. And I have the affidavit." For a moment, air rushed back into my lungs. They thought they had trapped me with forged signatures, but Patricia had peeled back a corner of their web. The next evening, I attended a senior community meeting. Standing before the group, I felt the weight of every rumor pressing against me, but instead of fighting fire with fire, I spoke plainly. "I've spent my life here," I said, my voice even. "Raised my daughter in these neighborhoods, paid my dues, made my sacrifices. What you've heard, those whispers, they're not the truth. My only flaw is loving too deeply, even when that love is thrown back at me." A hush spread across the room. Some nodded, some looked uncertain, but I could see cracks forming in the wall of gossip. Composure, not rage, was the tool that began to shift perception. 2 mornings later, a thick envelope arrived from the courthouse. My hands shook only slightly as I slid it open. The official notice stared back, A hearing date had been set. They had dragged me into their arena. I placed the letter flat on the table and whispered to myself, I won't walk in alone. The courthouse loomed over me like a monument to every mistake and sacrifice I had made. Patricia walked at my side, her file clutched tight against her chest, as though it held my last thread of dignity. The spring air in Houston was damp and heavy, and the crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps felt more like spectators at a spectacle than neighbors I had once trusted. Their whispers stung worse than the humid breeze. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The wood-paneled walls seemed to trap the weight of betrayal, pressing down on my shoulders. Shayna and Darren swept in next, Cliff Rydell close behind them, their smiles sharp as blades. They didn't even glance my way. They didn't need to. Their confidence said it all. They believed the verdict was already sealed in their favor. I steadied my breathing, forcing my hands to rest calmly on the table in front of me. But beneath the surface, tension coiled tight, every muscle ready to resist. This wasn't just a hearing. This was my life on trial, and my daughter had decided to play the executioner. Cliff Rydell was the first to rise. His voice carried easily, smooth and rehearsed. He laid out the stack of forged papers with the certainty of a man who'd done this dance too many times. Mr. Keyes willingly transferred his financial control, he declared, gesturing toward Shayna and Darren. The evidence is clear. His recent outbursts and confusion only confirm that he is no longer capable of managing his affairs responsibly. Shayna leaned forward, her face arranged in false concern. I love my father, Your Honor, but he's not the man he used to be. He forgets things. He lashes out. He's bitter. Each word was a dagger twisted into my chest. I gripped the underside of the table until my knuckles whitened. To sit in silence while my own flesh and blood painted me as senile, it was humiliation distilled to its cruelest form. I kept my jaw tight, because any outburst now would be twisted into their narrative. My silence had to speak louder than their lies. When Patricia stood, the atmosphere shifted. Her calm, deliberate tone cut through the performance like a knife. Your Honor, the documents presented here today are fraudulent. We can prove it. She called Harvey Denton to the stand. Harvey's voice carried warmth, a steady counterweight to the venom that had filled the room moments earlier. I've known Gerald for over 40 years. He is sharp, capable, and independent. I've sat with him, talked through complex matters with him just last week. The notion that he's incompetent is not only false, it's insulting. I caught Shayna's glare flicker toward Harvey, and for the first time, doubt crept across her carefully painted expression. Patricia leaned forward. And furthermore, Your Honor, evidence shows that the notary who supposedly validated these signatures has direct financial ties to Richard Boone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's eyebrows shot upward. Cliff Rydell shifted uncomfortably, his smooth veneer cracking under the weight of exposed corruption. The judge raised his hand, silencing the room. These are serious allegations. I will require substantiated proof before proceeding. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the scales tip ever so slightly back in my favor. When Mara was called to testify, the room fell into a hush. She sat trembling, her young hands folded in her lap. Her eyes darted toward her mother, then quickly away. The judge urged her to speak. Her voice quavered at first, but then it strengthened with every word. I overheard my mom and Darren talking. They said they needed to bleed Dad dry before the courts got involved. They said it would be easier if people thought he was already losing his mind. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Shayna shot to her feet, her face pale. Mara, stop. You don't know what you're talking about. The judge slammed his gavel. Sit down. Mrs. Grinstead, the witness will continue. Mara's voice broke, but the truth poured out anyway. I didn't want to believe it, but they planned it. All of it. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Even the Boones shifted uncomfortably, their polished facade cracking in the face of their granddaughter's honesty. The judge leaned back, eyes sharp as he surveyed the room. This court will recess before deliberation. I want all evidence thoroughly examined before I render a decision. The gavel struck again, and the sound echoed like thunder in my chest. Around me, the room erupted in hushed arguments and frantic whispers. Shayna clutched at Cliff Rydell, her earlier confidence shattered. Richard and Margaret sat stiff, staring straight ahead as if willing themselves invisible. For the first time, they looked shaken. I gathered my papers slowly, careful not to show the tremor in my hands. This wasn't victory yet, but it was a crack in their wall of lies. As I rose, I let the thought settle in, steady and sharp. The fight was far from over, but they had finally learned I wasn't walking into this battle alone. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of silence that pressed down heavier than noise ever could. After the courthouse recess, exhaustion seeped into my bones. My legs ached, my chest felt heavy, but beneath the fatigue there was a strange sense of pride. I hadn't folded. I hadn't let them write me off as some senile old man too blind to see his own name on a forged line. For once, the courtroom had seen through at least part of the smoke they'd tried to blow. Sitting at my kitchen table, I stared at the dented surface worn down by years of meals, bills, and small family moments. That table had seen Shayna grow up. Spilled milk, homework scribbles, birthday cakes with frosting dripping off the sides. All those years of sacrifice swirled in my head, double shifts at the refinery, unpaid medical bills I swallowed whole, dreams of travel packed away so she could go to college. Now those sacrifices seemed to hang in the air like ghosts, haunting me as I thought about how easily she'd tried to bury me in court. Sleep came in restless waves that night, broken by flashes of Shayna's voice on the stand, her words twisting like knives. He doesn't remember things anymore. He lashes out. He's confused. Lies. Each sentence felt like a slow erasure of who I was, of what I had built, of every memory that should have made her proud to be my daughter. The next afternoon, I wasn't surprised by the knock at the door. I knew her rhythm. 2 sharp taps, 1 pause, another light knock. Shayna stood in the doorway, her polished hair catching the sun, her perfume too strong for such a simple visit. She walked in without asking, just like she always did. For a moment, I almost saw the little girl clutching her lunchbox, begging me to check her homework, but the woman standing there now looked nothing like that child. "It's not personal. Dad, it's survival," she said, her voice steady but eyes darting. "You wouldn't understand what it's like to be me, to have expectations, to have to keep up appearances." I leaned on my cane and studied her, the woman I had raised, the woman who now spoke of survival as if it meant bleeding her father dry. "You think money will keep you warm at night when your conscience turns cold?" I asked quietly. My chest tightened as I said it, not from weakness, but from the sting of knowing she truly believed her reasoning. She sighed, frustration spilling out. "I'm not your enemy, but I can't let you stand in the way, either." Her words cut deeper than her testimony in court. Watching my own daughter put survival above family, above blood, was the kind of wound no doctor could mend. When she left, the air in the room felt emptier than before. Later that week, I sat across from Patricia Lowell again. She had a stack of papers, and that unflinching look lawyers wear when the truth is uglier than you want it to be. "Gerald," she said, "you've already stood stronger than most men would, but this fight, it's bigger than you. Do you realize that?" I frowned. "Bigger than me?" She leaned forward. "Every senior who's ever been told they're too old, too weak, too confused, that's who you're fighting for. If you win, you don't just save yourself, you set a precedent." Her words settled in my chest, heavy but clarifying. For weeks, I'd thought this battle was only about my home, my dignity, my name, but Patricia was right. Every insult Shayna threw, every forged page Richard Boone planted, every whisper Darren spread, it wasn't just about tearing me down. It was a message to anyone who dared grow old in a world that treated age as weakness. That realization made my blood run hotter, not colder. That evening, Mara Doss came by. Her hand shook as she stood on my porch, guilt written across her face. "Granddad," she whispered, though she'd never called me that before. "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." I saw the fear in her eyes, the weight she carried for staying silent while her parents schemed. Placing a hand gently on her shoulder, I said, It takes courage to tell the truth when everyone around you is lying. You did that in court. That matters. Her tears slipped free, but I felt something heal inside me. For the first time in months, I saw a spark of the future in her, a glimpse of a generation that might still learn from the mistakes of the one before. When the house grew still again, I opened my journal. My handwriting wavered, but the words came clear. Blood betrayed me, but dignity carried me further than greed ever could. I closed the book and set it beside my bed. Tomorrow would come with the weight of finality. The last day in court was waiting, and with it, the chance to show them all that age is not weakness, it's memory, resilience, and the kind of strength greed could never buy. The courthouse felt different that morning, as though the very air held its breath. Light poured through tall windows, catching the dust motes and making them shimmer like restless thoughts. Walking into that room, cane tapping steadily against the marble floor, carried more weight than any banquet hall or family dinner ever had. They couldn't take my dignity, no matter how many papers they forged or how many whispers they spread. That truth steadied me. Shayna, Darren, and the Boones were already seated, smug in their postures, whispering to Cliff Rydell as though the verdict was already theirs. Their eyes darted toward me, expecting hesitation or weakness. But what I carried wasn't fear, it was resolve. Behind me, rows of familiar faces from church and the neighborhood filled the benches. Their presence reminded me that this fight was no longer private. It belonged to every elder who had been silenced by greed. Patricia Lowell stood with the calm assurance of someone who had built her arguments piece by piece, like a mason laying stone. She spoke of truth, of sacrifice, and of the dignity owed to a man who had carried his family on his back for decades. She presented Mara's testimony, Harvey Denton's unwavering support, and, most damning of all, the bribed notary evidence that tied directly back to Richard Boone. The room shifted when Cliff Rydell rose, voice sharp as ever, trying to tear holes in the case. But then his own words betrayed him. A question too specific, a slip of the tongue, it revealed his role in coaching Shayna to replicate my handwriting. Gasps rippled across the benches. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing, Shayna's face drained of color. For once, her confidence faltered. When pressed, her words stumbled, tangled between denial and half-formed explanations. Richard and Margaret turned on Darren, their voices desperate, blaming him for taking things too far. Darren erupted, shouting that it had been their idea from the start. The family's unity collapsed before my eyes. The judge's gavel struck, restoring order. His words rang out, steady and final. I was competent. The guardianship petition was dismissed. Further, an investigation into the Boone family's conspiracy was ordered. For the first time in months, my chest loosened. Though the ache of betrayal lingered, relief and sorrow lived side by side. Relief for justice, sorrow for what my daughter had become. After court, Shayna followed me outside. Her voice trembled, no longer sharp, but pleading. Dad, I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, forgive me. She reached for my arm, and for a moment, I saw the little girl I had once carried on my shoulders, giggling at fireworks in the Texas sky. I forgive you as my daughter, I said quietly, looking her in the eye. But I will never excuse what you tried to take from me. Some wounds don't heal with apologies. They heal with truth. Her hand fell away. She turned, shoulders slumped, swallowed by the crowd. That evening, back home, I sat with Mara. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. She listened as I spoke of family, of storms weathered, of roots that run deep. Greed can tear a family apart, I told her, but dignity can outlast betrayal. We elders are not burdens, we are the roots, and roots, no matter how fierce the storm, always hold the ground. The night settled around us like a blanket. Justice had been restored, though scars remained, yet those scars carried a message for every senior sitting alone at their table, every elder doubting their worth. Never surrender your voice. You are stronger than their schemes, stronger than their greed.